Picture this: a prince standing 6 feet tall, decorated with military honors, celebrated across Europe as a hero of the Cretan mission. A man with royal blood running through his veins, connected by family ties to the crowned heads of Denmark, Greece, and Britain. A man who, by every outward measure, had everything. Now picture that same man trapped. Not in a dungeon, not in exile, trapped inside a life that was never his. A marriage built on deception, a military career handed to him as a distraction, and a family that knew exactly who he was and chose, deliberately, to use that knowledge as a weapon. This is the story of Prince George of Greece and Denmark, and it is one of the most calculated betrayals in royal history. What makes George's story different from the usual royal scandals, the wars, the beheadings, the poisonings, is how quiet it was. There were no public executions, no dramatic exile announced in the court gazette. His destruction was slow, methodical, and carried out by the very people who were supposed to protect him. His own father, his own family, the institution he served with his entire life. George was queer. In an era when that word didn't yet exist in the way we use it today, what George was, the nature of his deepest bonds, the person he actually loved, was something his family understood perfectly. And instead of protecting him, they used it. They packaged him into a strategic marriage, handed him impossible political assignments designed to fail, and when the moment came to choose between their son and political convenience, they didn't hesitate for a single second. Here is what makes this story truly disturbing. The woman they married him to was one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. Marie Bonaparte, granddaughter of Napoleon's brother, future pioneer of psychoanalysis, personal friend of Sigmund Freud, was not a passive victim. She was sharp enough to figure out exactly what her marriage was, and she documented it. In clinical, devastating detail, every secret George's family worked so hard to bury, his wife quietly excavated and handed to history. So what you're about to watch is not just the story of a queer royal in a hostile era. It is the story of a man betrayed on every front simultaneously, politically abandoned by his father, personally exposed by his wife, and erased by the institution that created him. And the bitter irony at the heart of it all? The woman they chose to silence him became a legend. George became a footnote. We are going to change that today. If royal secrets, calculated betrayals, and the hidden lives of history's most powerful families fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, please subscribe to the channel. Because what I'm about to reveal will show you just how ruthlessly a royal family could destroy one of their own when he didn't fit the mold. Let's start at the very beginning. Because to understand how George was betrayed, you first need to understand the family that betrayed him, and where they actually came from. Here is something most people don't know about the Greek royal family. They weren't Greek, not even slightly. When Greece finally broke free from Ottoman rule and established itself as an independent kingdom in the early 19th century, the new nation needed a king. The European powers, Britain, France, and Russia, got together and essentially held an audition. They needed someone who looked royal, came from a respectable dynasty, and wouldn't cause too much trouble. What they did not need was someone with any actual connection to Greece, its people, its language, or its history. Their first choice, Otto of Bavaria, lasted a few decades before a military coup threw him out in 1862. Back to the audition room. This time, the choice landed on a 17-year-old Danish prince named Wilhelm of Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, Glücksburg. He had no Greek heritage, spoke no Greek, and had never set foot in the country. He was given a new name, George V, packed onto a boat, and shipped south to rule a nation of strangers. This is the world Prince George of Greece was born into on June 24, 1869. He was the third child of King George I and Queen Olga, herself a Russian Grand Duchess from the Romanov family. On paper, the bloodline was impeccable. Danish royalty on one side, Russian imperial on the other. George grew up surrounded by titles, palaces, and the constant hum of European diplomatic machinery. But here is what those palace walls actually contained: cold calculation dressed up as family life. King George I was not a warm man. He was a political operator who understood, better than almost anyone, that his family's grip on the Greek throne was fragile. Greece was a young, unstable nation surrounded by ambitious neighbors. The Ottoman Empire still controlled territory the Greeks considered theirs. Nationalist movements were simmering everywhere. In this environment, every member of the royal family was a diplomatic asset first and a human being second. George grew up watching his father treat marriage, military appointments, and public appearances as instruments of state policy. Emotion was something you managed privately, if at all. Vulnerability was a liability. The family name was everything, and it needed to be protected at any cost. George had siblings who navigated this environment by conforming perfectly. His brother Constantine would go on to become King of Greece. His sisters married into European royal houses with textbook precision. The Glücksburg machine ran smoothly on strategic alliances and carefully managed public images. And then there was George. Tall, athletic, decorated, everything a royal son should be on the outside. But increasingly, privately, something didn't fit. The connections he formed, the relationships that actually sustained him, the life he wanted to live, none of it matched the role his family had already written for him. He had no idea yet just how ruthlessly they would enforce that script, but the first signs were already there. And they started younger than anyone in that palace was willing to admit. Let's talk about what Prince George of Greece actually looked like, because it matters to this story. He was enormous, 6 feet 5 inches tall, a giant by the standards of the 19th century, with broad shoulders, a naval officer's posture, and the kind of commanding physical presence that made people step back when he walked into a room. Photographs of George show a man who looked like central casting's idea of a European prince. Strong jaw, steady gaze, military decorations lined up across his chest like a wall of respectability. He was, in every visible sense, exactly what the House of Glücksburg needed him to be. But here is the thing about royal families and their carefully constructed images. The more perfect the exterior, the more pressure building underneath. And the people closest to George, the ones who actually spent time with him beyond the formal portraits and state dinners, were noticing something that didn't fit the official picture. George was not forming the kinds of bonds his family expected him to form. From his youth, the relationships that animated him most, the connections he sought out and returned to with consistency and emotional depth, were with men. Not in the scandalous, whispered way that court gossip sometimes invented about royals to settle political scores. In a quieter, more sustained way that was in many respects more revealing precisely because it wasn't dramatic. It was just real. More real, by every account, than anything else in his life. The most significant of these relationships, and the one that historians have returned to most consistently, was with his cousin, Prince Waldemar of Denmark. Waldemar was George's first cousin, the son of King Frederick VIII of Denmark. Their families intersected constantly through the dense web of European royal connections, and George and Waldemar had known each other since childhood. But what developed between them went well beyond the ordinary closeness of royal cousins who see each other at family gatherings. Their correspondence was extensive. Their time together was sought out, not merely tolerated as dynastic obligation. The emotional register of their relationship, documented in letters and noted by contemporaries, carried a weight and intensity that those around them found difficult to categorize and easy to be uncomfortable about. Court environments in the late 19th century did not have the language we have today, but they had eyes. And the people watching George and Waldemar interact knew, even without the vocabulary to say it plainly, that what they were witnessing was something the institution could not accommodate. George, to his credit, never seemed particularly tortured by who he was in private. The torment came later, and it came from outside, from the people who decided that his private self was a problem that needed managing. In the meantime, he did what royal sons were expected to do. He pursued a military career, distinguished himself in the navy, and presented the world with the image of a capable, confident prince moving steadily toward his royal destiny. It was a performance, and his family were about to cast him in an even bigger one. By the time George reached his mid-30s, the clock his family was running on his behalf had nearly expired. Royal sons in the European tradition had a defined window. You completed your military service, you distinguished yourself in some suitably prestigious capacity, and then, most critically, you married. You produced heirs, you secured the dynastic line, you performed in public and in private, the role of husband and father with enough conviction that the court could maintain the fiction that everything was proceeding normally. George had done the first two parts. The third was becoming a problem. The women paraded through his orbit left him unmoved in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. His family watched. They calculated. And then, in the way that royal families throughout history have handled inconvenient truths about their members, they found a solution that served everyone's interests except George's. Her name was Marie Bonaparte. She was 21 years old when they married in 1907, and she was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary woman. She was the great-grandniece of Napoleon Bonaparte, which gave her a name that resonated across Europe. More practically, she was extraordinarily wealthy. Her maternal grandfather had made a fortune in Monaco's casino industry, and Marie had inherited a substantial portion of it. For the House of Glucksburg, perpetually anxious about finances and political standing, Marie's fortune was not a minor consideration. But Marie was not just rich. She was brilliant, intellectually restless, psychologically perceptive, and burning with ambitions that had nowhere to go in the society she'd been born into. She wanted a life of the mind. She wanted to matter beyond her bloodline. She wanted, underneath all of it, to be genuinely loved. She was going to get none of those things from this marriage. George's family presented the union as ideal. A prestigious royal title for Marie, a wealthy, well-connected wife for George, mutual benefit all around. What nobody told Marie, what she would spend years piecing together herself, through pain and confusion and eventually the rigorous application of psychoanalytic theory, was that the man she was marrying was not available to her in the ways that mattered most. The early years of their marriage were, by the accounts Marie herself later documented, deeply lonely. George was not cruel to her. He was not openly dismissive. He was simply absent, present in the physical sense, performing the requirements of the marriage in the minimal technical ways necessary, but emotionally located somewhere else entirely, in correspondence, in visits, in a relationship with his cousin Waldemar that continued to carry more of his authentic self than anything happening inside his own marriage. Marie noticed everything. She was that kind of woman, and she was already beginning to ask the questions that would eventually lead her straight to Sigmund Freud's consulting room in Vienna. Guys, if you're as gripped by this story as I am, please subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to reveal next will show you exactly how this unraveling began, and just how brutally George's family had already set him up to fail long before Marie ever started writing anything down. The first betrayal didn't come from his wife. It came from his father, and it happened on an island. Before his marriage collapsed, before his wife started writing her devastating notes, before any of the private betrayals became impossible to ignore, George's family destroyed him publicly first, and they did it on the island of Crete. To understand what happened there, You need to understand what Crete meant in 1898. The island had been under Ottoman control for centuries, and the Greek population living there had been fighting, sometimes violently, for union with Greece, a cause known as enosis. The great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, had intervened to stabilize the situation, establishing Crete as an autonomous state under nominal Ottoman sovereignty. They needed a High Commissioner to govern it, someone with enough royal prestige to command respect, enough diplomatic weight to manage the competing interests of 4 European powers, and enough family connection to Greece to satisfy nationalist sentiment without inflaming Ottoman relations. They chose George. On December 21, 1898, Prince George of Greece arrived in Crete as its first High Commissioner. The reception was extraordinary. Crowds lined the harbor. Flags waved. Cannons fired salutes. The Cretan people looked at this tall, decorated Greek prince and saw, finally, someone who might actually deliver what they had been fighting and dying for: union with Greece. George threw himself into the role with genuine commitment. He was not a sophisticated political operator in the way his father was, but he was earnest and he worked hard. He traveled across the island, met with community leaders, and presented himself as a ruler who took the Cretans' aspirations seriously. For a few years, it worked. George was genuinely popular, but the situation on the ground was more combustible than any royal appointment could contain. Nationalist sentiment was intensifying. A rising political figure, named Eleftherios Venizelos, sharp, charismatic, and completely unintimidated by royal titles, was leading the movement demanding immediate enosis. George, constrained by the agreement with the great powers that had given him the role in the first place, could not simply declare union with Greece. His authority depended on maintaining the diplomatic balance the European powers had established. Venizelos and George clashed directly. By 1905, Venizelos had organized an open revolt, establishing a rival assembly at Theriso and declaring union with Greece unilaterally. George was facing an active insurrection on his own island. Here is where the story turns brutal. George looked to his father for support. King George I of Greece was, after all, not just his father, but his king. The man whose dynasty George was literally representing on that island. The man for whom George had accepted this difficult, pressure-filled assignment in the first place. King George I sided with Venizelos, not quietly, not ambiguously. The Greek government, with his father's full knowledge and approval, made clear that George's position was untenable. The great powers reached the same conclusion. In 1906, after 8 years of service, George was forced to resign his position as High Commissioner of Crete and leave the island. Venizelos, the man who had revolted against George directly, would go on to become one of the most celebrated statesmen in Greek history. He eventually delivered enosis in 1913. George sailed home to a family that had just demonstrated, with perfect clarity, exactly how much he was worth to them when political convenience pointed the other way. And waiting for him in that home was a wife who had been paying very close attention. Marie Bonaparte was not the kind of woman who suffered in silence and called it dignity. She was the kind of woman who suffered, picked up a pen, and turned her pain into evidence. By the time George returned from Crete in 1906, their marriage was already a quiet disaster. They had 2 children, Peter, born in 1905, and Eugenie, born in 1906, which meant the marriage had functioned, technically, in the minimal biological sense his family required. But the emotional reality inside that household was something Marie had been cataloguing with increasing precision, and what she had recorded was not a marriage. It was a performance. A contract dressed up in wedding clothes, held together by dynastic obligation and the mutual understanding that neither of them could publicly afford for it to fall apart. George was not present in the ways that mattered. He was not cruel. He was not violent. He simply directed the deeper currents of his emotional life elsewhere, toward Waldemar, toward his correspondence, toward everything that existed outside the walls of the life his family had constructed for him. For a woman of Marie's intelligence and appetite for genuine connection, this was not a tolerable situation. It was a psychological puzzle she was determined to solve. And she had exactly the right tools to solve it. Marie had been intellectually restless her entire life. She had grown up largely isolated. Her mother died when she was an infant. Her father, Prince Roland Bonaparte, was emotionally distant, and she had educated herself voraciously from the family library with the focused intensity of someone who had nothing else. By the time she married George, she was already deeply engaged with the emerging science of psychology. The human mind, its hidden mechanisms, its buried drives, its capacity for self-deception, fascinated her in ways that the diplomatic small talk of royal life never could. When she discovered the work of Sigmund Freud, something clicked into place. She began corresponding with Freud in the late 1920s, eventually traveling to Vienna to undergo psychoanalysis with him personally. What she brought to those sessions was years of documented experience, her own emotional history, her childhood, and the intimate details of a marriage that had left her confused, wounded, and searching for explanation. Freud found in Marie one of his most brilliant students. Marie found in Freud the framework she needed to finally understand what had happened to her. She didn't just undergo analysis. She became a practicing psychoanalyst herself, eventually co-founding the French Psychoanalytic Society in 1926 alongside Freud's other collaborators. She published papers. She translated Freud's work into French. She built, from the wreckage of her royal marriage, one of the most remarkable intellectual careers of the 20th century. And she wrote about George. Not sensationally, not vindictively. With the same clinical precision she applied to everything else. Her personal writings and documented accounts of the marriage, studied by biographers and historians in the decades since, paint a portrait of a woman who went looking for answers and found them, and of a man whose family had handed him to her as a solution to their problem, without the slightest consideration for what it would cost either of them. Marie Bonaparte didn't destroy George's secret. His family had already done that by making the secret necessary in the first place. She simply refused to pretend she couldn't see it. And what she saw, and what she wrote, was about to become the most enduring record of everything George's family had tried so hard to erase. Let's talk about what George's life looked like from the inside. Not the official version, not the portrait of the decorated naval officer, the High Commissioner of Crete, the dutiful royal husband. The version that existed underneath all of that, the one that animated him, sustained him, and ultimately became the most honest record of who he actually was. That version centered on one person, Prince Waldemar of Denmark. Waldemar was born in 1858, making him 11 years older than George. He was the fifth son of King Christian IX of Denmark, the same King Christian IX who was George's paternal grandfather, which made Waldemar and George first cousins once removed. In the dense, tangled web of European royal genealogy, this kind of connection was entirely unremarkable. Royal cousins saw each other constantly, corresponded regularly, and maintained lifelong relationships simply by virtue of sharing bloodlines that kept intersecting at every dynastic occasion. What was remarkable was the nature of this particular connection. The historical record on George and Waldemar is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. There is no single dramatic letter, no scandalous document that historians have waved in the air as definitive proof of the relationship's nature. What exists instead is something more telling. A sustained, consistent pattern of emotional investment that stands in sharp contrast to everything else in George's documented life. Their correspondence was extensive and continued across decades. George's letters to Waldemar, those that have been examined by historians studying both men, carry a register of intimacy and emotional dependency that is simply absent from his other documented relationships. When George was in Crete, struggling with the political pressures of his High Commissioner role, it was not his father he wrote to with candor. When his marriage was hollowing out, it was not to Marie that he turned for genuine emotional sustenance. Contemporaries noticed. Court environments are ecosystems of observation, everyone watching everyone else, cataloging deviations from expected behavior, filing away details for future use. The frequency and intensity of George's contact with Waldemar was noted by people in both the Greek and Danish royal circles. It generated the kind of carefully unspoken awareness that royal courts specialized in, everyone knowing, nobody saying, the collective silence maintained as long as it remained politically convenient. Waldemar himself was a naval officer, like George, another point of genuine connection beyond the dynastic accident of their shared bloodline. He had married Princess Marie of Orléans in 1885, a marriage that produced 5 children and proceeded with the orderly external regularity expected of royal unions. But his relationship with George continued alongside it, sustained and apparently undiminished by the decades passing around them. What did their relationship actually consist of, in physical terms? Historians are honest about the limits of the evidence here. The documentary record establishes emotional intimacy and sustained prioritization of each other's company and correspondence. It does not provide the kind of explicit documentation that removes all ambiguity. What it does establish, clearly and consistently, is that George organized significant portions of his emotional life around this relationship in ways he never did around his marriage, his children, or his political career. For a man living in early 20th century royal Europe, that was not a safe thing to do. Royal families had long memories and short tolerances for anything that complicated the dynastic machinery. George had already seen in Crete exactly how his family responded when he became inconvenient. He understood the terms of his existence clearly. He kept writing to Waldemar anyway, because when everything else in his life was performance, and by this point almost everything was, this was the one place where something real was allowed to exist. And the people around him were watching every word. While George drifted, Marie Bonaparte built an empire. That is not a metaphor. It is the most accurate way to describe what happened in the decades following the collapse of whatever hope Marie had carried into her marriage. George's family had handed him to her as a solution to their problem. What they had not calculated, what nobody in the House of Glucksburg had apparently considered for a single moment, was that Marie Bonaparte was not the kind of woman who absorbed a wound and stayed quiet. She was the kind of woman who transformed wounds into weapons, and her weapon of choice was the human mind. By the late 1920s, Marie had moved decisively into the world of psychoanalysis. This was not a casual intellectual hobby. She pursued it with the same relentless focus she applied to everything, reading voraciously, corresponding with the leading psychological thinkers of the era, and eventually making direct contact with the man whose work had reorganized her understanding of her own life. Sigmund Freud was, by the time Marie reached him, the most famous and controversial figure in modern psychology. His ideas about the unconscious, about repressed desires, about the hidden architecture of human behavior, had detonated through European intellectual life like a bomb. Many people found him disturbing. Marie found him clarifying. She began formal psychoanalysis with Freud in Vienna in 1925. Their relationship quickly evolved beyond the clinical. Freud recognized in Marie an intellect that matched his own appetite for rigorous inquiry. And Marie recognized in Freud the father figure her emotionally absent biological father had never been. They became collaborators, correspondents, and, in the deepest sense, intellectual partners. Freud called her one of his most valued students. Their letters, published after both their deaths, reveal a relationship of extraordinary mutual respect and genuine warmth. Marie used her considerable fortune to fund psychoanalytic research and publication. She co-founded the Paris Psychoanalytic Society, trained as a practicing analyst, and published her own clinical papers, including work that drew, with careful clinical distance, on her own experience. The unhappy royal marriage that George's family had arranged as a management strategy for their inconvenient son had accidentally produced one of the founding figures of French psychoanalysis. But Marie's most significant act, the one that history remembers most vividly, had nothing to do with publishing papers or founding institutions. In 1938, Adolf Hitler's forces annexed Austria. Freud, who was Jewish, was suddenly in mortal danger in Vienna. The Nazis had already ransacked his publishing house. His books had been burned. Arrest and worse were entirely plausible outcomes. Freud was 81 years old, suffering from the advanced jaw cancer that had plagued him for years, and deeply reluctant to leave the city that had been his home for nearly 8 decades. Marie Bonaparte went to Vienna and refused to leave without him. She negotiated with the Gestapo directly, using her royal title and her considerable personal fortune to secure the exit visas necessary to get Freud, his wife, and his daughter Anna out of Nazi-controlled Austria. The ransom she paid, documented in historical accounts of the period, was substantial. She paid it without hesitation. Freud reached London safely in June 1938. He died there the following year, in September 1939, surrounded by his family. He was safe because of Marie. George, in that same period, was doing nothing that history felt any particular need to record. The contrast could not have been more complete. The woman his family had acquired as a dynastic asset had become a figure of genuine historical consequence, saving lives, building institutions, expanding human understanding of the mind. The prince they had sacrificed her to was fading into the comfortable irrelevance of a royal footnote. His family had made a calculation about Marie Bonaparte. They had been wrong about her in every conceivable way. And George was living in the shadow of that miscalculation for the rest of his life. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs exclusively to people who have been erased by institutions. Not the loneliness of poverty or illness or social rejection. Those things announce themselves. They have edges you can find and push against. The loneliness that settled over George in his later years was quieter and in many ways more complete. It was the loneliness of a man who had been made irrelevant by design, carefully, systematically, by the very apparatus that had created him, and who now had to continue existing inside that irrelevance for decades, surrounded by all the external markers of royal privilege, while the actual substance of a meaningful life receded further with each passing year. George lived until 1957. He was 87 years old when he died. That is a long time to be a footnote. The world around him transformed almost beyond recognition across those final decades. The royal houses of Europe were shaken and reshuffled by 2 world wars. The Ottoman Empire, the great rival against which Greek nationalism had defined itself for a century, collapsed entirely after the First World War. Greece itself lurched through political crisis after political crisis. The catastrophic defeat in the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, the abolition and restoration of the monarchy multiple times, the brutal German occupation during the Second World War, and the devastating civil war that followed it. Through all of it, George occupied the margins. His military career had effectively ended with Crete. The political capital he might have accumulated from that posting had been spent by his father's betrayal and never rebuilt. He held various nominal titles and ceremonial positions across the years, the kind of appointments that royal families hand to members they need to keep visible enough to be useful, but sidelined enough to cause no trouble. He attended state functions. He appeared in family photographs. He performed the basic ceremonial requirements of his existence with the dutiful consistency of a man who had accepted, somewhere along the way, that performance was all that was going to be asked of him. His marriage to Marie continued formally until his death, which is itself a remarkable fact. They did not divorce. In the world of early 20th century royalty, divorce carried consequences that neither party could easily absorb, and whatever private accommodation they reached, whatever unspoken treaty governed the management of their shared public existence, it held. They maintained separate intellectual and emotional lives with increasing openness as the decades passed. Marie pursued her psychoanalytic career with the full freedom her fortune and her title provided. George maintained his correspondence, his connections, his private life. Prince Waldemar of Denmark died in 1939. He was 80 years old. Whatever George felt about that loss, he felt it privately, in the way he had felt everything that actually mattered to him, away from the official record, beyond the reach of the court correspondents and the dynastic archivists whose job was to document everything except the truth. The Greek monarchy was abolished by referendum in 1974, nearly 2 decades after George's death. The House of Glucksburg, that Danish import shipped south to rule a nation of strangers in 1863, was formally finished as a ruling institution. The calculation that King George I had built his entire reign around, the calculation that had required his son to be packaged and managed and eventually discarded, had ultimately produced a dynasty that lasted just over a century before the people it ruled voted it out of existence. George died on November 25, 1957 in London. The official records note his passing with the appropriate royal formalities. The obituaries listed his titles, his military decorations, his family connections. They noted his role in Crete. They mentioned his marriage to Marie Bonaparte. They did not mention Waldemar. They did not mention the marriage's true nature, documented in Marie's own writings, available to any historian willing to look. They did not mention what it had cost him, what it costs anyone, to spend a lifetime performing a self that was never theirs to begin with. His family had enforced that silence his entire life. In death, the silence simply continued. But history, it turns out, is not as obedient as royal families would like it to be. Here is what history did with Prince George of Greece. It gave everything to Marie Bonaparte. And for a long time, for most of the 20th century in fact, that felt like the end of the story. Marie got the biographies, the academic papers, the retrospective celebrations. She got the documentaries and the university courses, and the feminist historians who held her up, correctly, as a woman who had refused to be defined by the limitations her era placed on her. She got remembered. George got footnoted. Mentioned briefly, in passing, as the royal husband whose inadequacies had accidentally propelled one of the founding figures of French psychoanalysis toward her destiny. But history has a way of circling back. In recent decades, as LGBTQ+ historical scholarship has expanded and deepened, researchers have returned to figures like George with new frameworks and renewed attention. The question is no longer simply what happened to these individuals. It is what their stories reveal about the systems that shaped, constrained, and ultimately destroyed them. And George's story, examined through that lens, turns out to be considerably more significant than a footnote in Marie Bonaparte's biography. What George's life illustrates, with almost clinical precision, is the mechanism by which royal institutions historically managed queerness in their ranks. It was not, in most cases, violent. It was not the scaffold or the dungeon. It was something more sophisticated and in many ways more total. It was the strategic deployment of marriage as containment, the use of prestigious but doomed appointments to keep inconvenient members visibly occupied, and the careful maintenance of silence, enforced not through direct threat, but through the unstated understanding that the institution's needs would always override the individual's truth. George was not unique in experiencing this. Royal and aristocratic families across Europe applied versions of the same mechanism to queer members throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. What makes George's case unusually well documented is Marie. Because she refused to participate in the silence. Because she had both the intellectual tools and the personal freedom to process what had happened to her and leave a record. And because Freud, the man she saved from the Nazis, had taught her that the truth, however uncomfortable, was always more useful than the story constructed to replace it. Modern biographers of Marie Bonaparte, including Celia Bertin, whose comprehensive biography remains a foundational text, have examined the marriage in detail that would have been unthinkable during George's lifetime. Historians of Greek royalty have revisited George's Cretan career with appreciation for the impossible position he was placed in. Sent to manage a nationalist crisis with one hand tied behind his back by the very father who had appointed him. LGBTQ+ historians have placed George within a broader pattern of royal queerness that shaped European dynastic history in ways that are still being fully excavated. What emerges from all of this is a portrait more complete and more human than anything his family ever intended to allow. A man who was genuinely capable, as a naval officer, as an administrator, as someone who earned real affection from the Cretan people before politics swallowed him. A man who loved, consistently and deeply, in a direction his family could not accommodate. A man who survived the betrayals that were dealt to him with a quiet dignity that the historical record, if you look carefully enough, actually honors. His family wanted silence. They got a century of it, but the scholars kept looking, and Marie kept writing, and history kept circling back. George of Greece deserved better than the life his family constructed for him. He deserved to be known on his own terms, not as a footnote to someone else's remarkable story. And the fact that we can finally tell his story, with honesty, with precision, with the historical evidence that his family spent decades trying to suppress, is itself a form of justice. Small, late, but real. So, what shocked you most about George's story? Was it the political betrayal in Crete? The calculated cruelty of that marriage arrangement? Or the fact that the woman they used as a tool to silence him ended up saving one of the most important minds of the 20th century? Comment below. I read every single one, and I want to know which betrayal hit hardest for you. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because next week I'm bringing you another royal whose family destroyed them from the inside out. And I promise you, it will make even this look straightforward. History is full of people who were erased on purpose. We are just getting started finding them.